Gary and Carol had never been ones to involve themselves in petty neighborhood politics. They had spent years saving up for a home in what was advertised as a quiet, friendly, eco-conscious community. It had seemed perfect: tree-lined streets, well-maintained sidewalks, and houses that looked like something out of a suburban paradise. When they signed the paperwork and received their keys, they had no idea that they were walking into what would soon become a nightmare. At first, life in the neighborhood was pleasant. The neighbors were polite, if not a little reserved. The lawns were always perfectly trimmed, and the streets were impeccably clean. Almost too clean, like something out of a dystopian novel. It wasn't until their third week living there that they received their first real introduction to Karen, the head of the homeowner association. Karen was a thin, sharp-featured woman in her mid-50s with an air of self-importance that seemed almost theatrical. She always wore pressed linen clothes, oversized sunglasses, and carried a clipboard with color-coded notes that she clutched like a weapon. The first time she knocked on their door, Gary had assumed she was just another neighbor stopping by to say hello. He had been wrong. "Hello," she had greeted, her lips curving into a practiced smile, though her eyes remained cold. "You must be the new residents, Gary and Carol, correct?" Gary, holding the door open, nodded. "That's us. Nice to meet you." "Yes, yes," she interrupted with a wave of her hand, already glancing over their front yard like she was evaluating a crime scene. "I'm Karen, president of the homeowner association. I just wanted to personally welcome you and go over a few of our community expectations. Have you had a chance to read through the bylaws?" Gary had exchanged a glance with Carol, who had just stepped up beside him. Yeah, we skimmed through them." Karen's smile tightened. "Skim is dangerous. Rules exist for a reason, dear. They keep everything structured and harmonious. We wouldn't want any disruptions." Carol raised an eyebrow. "We're pretty good at following rules, don't worry. Is there something specific we should know?" Karen's fingers tightened around the clipboard. "There is one important new amendment that the homeowner association passed last month. It's quite unique to our community. You see, this is a meat-free neighborhood." Gary had let out a short laugh, thinking it was a joke. "You mean like no slaughterhouses or meat processing facilities?" Karen's expression didn't change. "I mean no meat, period. No grilling, no cooking, and certainly no purchasing meat products to be consumed in our community. We believe in a cruelty-free, environmentally sustainable way of living." Silence. Carol blinked as if trying to process whether she had actually heard what she thought she did. "Wait, you mean we can't even cook meat inside our own house?" "That is correct," Karen confirmed, her tone clipped and professional, as though she were explaining the fine print of a legal contract. "We take the health and ethical well-being of our community very seriously. Studies show that even the smell of cooked meat can be triggering to individuals who have chosen a plant-based lifestyle. We have members in our homeowner association with deeply held convictions, and we must respect their values." Gary crossed his arms, his amusement quickly fading. "So you're telling me I can't eat a steak in my own home because someone else doesn't like it?" Karen's nostrils flared slightly, but her voice remained calm. "We are a collective, Mr. Green. We operate on unity. If everyone follows the rules, it creates harmony. If someone disrupts that balance, well..." She let her words hang in the air. Surely, as a new homeowner, you wouldn't want to start off on the wrong foot. There was something about the way she said it, a veiled threat hidden beneath her overly polite tone. Carol must have sensed it too, because she quickly stepped in. "We'll, take a look at the bylaw updates. Thanks for letting us know." Karen nodded sharply as though pleased with herself. "Excellent. And remember, violations will not be tolerated. We'll be watching." And with that, she turned on her heel and strode away, clipboard clutched like a judge's gavel, leaving Gary and Carol standing in the doorway, still reeling from what had just happened. "What the hell was that?" Gary finally muttered. Carol rubbed her temples. "I don't know, but we're not seriously going to follow that rule, are we?" Gary scoffed. "Not a chance. I'm not going to let some control-freak homeowner association president tell me what I can or can't eat in my own damn house." The first violation had started with small warnings. One morning, Carol found a note on their doorstep. "We noticed a suspicious grocery bag containing animal products being carried into your home. Consider this your first warning." Gary had rolled his eyes. They're seriously watching our groceries? Then came the second warning. They had been grilling burgers in their backyard when, within minutes, Karen had appeared at the fence, arms crossed, lips pursed in disgust. "This is a direct violation of the homeowner association agreement," she had said, voice dripping with condescension. "I would advise you to extinguish that disgusting display of carnage immediately before further action is taken." Gary had stared at her incredulously. "Are you serious?" Karen didn't flinch. "I'm always serious when it comes to maintaining the standards of our community." Gary, feeling his blood boil, held her gaze as he bit into his burger, slowly, deliberately. Karen's face twisted in rage, but she had said nothing more. She simply turned and stormed away. But Gary could have sworn he saw her pull out her phone, as if taking notes or gathering evidence. The next day, a $500 violation fine was taped to their door. Gary ripped it down and crushed it in his fist. "This woman is insane." Carol, standing beside him, looked genuinely concerned now. "I think we just made an enemy." Gary scoffed. "Good. Let's see how far she's willing to take this little." Did he know Karen was willing to take it all the way? The fine was just the beginning. Gary tossed the crumpled violation notice onto the kitchen counter and turned to Carol, who was already scrolling through her phone, searching for anything that could prove the homeowner association had no legal standing to enforce their ridiculous meat ban. "This is insane," she muttered, her eyes darting across the screen. "There's no way they can actually do this." Gary exhaled sharply and leaned against the counter. "They're doing it, Em, and they're not stopping." The next morning, the harassment escalated. It started small, strange, seemingly coincidental inconveniences. Their trash cans disappeared overnight, forcing them to call the city for replacement. The next day, they woke up to find their sprinkler system mysteriously broken, the lawn already starting to brown under the relentless summer sun. That evening, the internet cut out mid-call while Carol was working from home, and when Gary checked the router, he found that someone had ripped out the cables. It wasn't just petty vandalism, it was a message. But the biggest shock came 2 days later when Gary stepped outside to retrieve the mail and found a certified letter taped to their front door. The homeowner association's official letterhead glared at him from the envelope. Carol hovered over his shoulder as he tore it open and unfolded the crisp sheet of paper. "Notice of legal action, dear Mr. and Miss Green. It has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that you have willfully and repeatedly violated the community guidelines outlined in Section 14, be ethical and environmental standards, specifically regarding the prohibition of animal products. Effective immediately, the Homeowner Association is issuing a final cease and desist order against your household. Failure to comply will result in further penalties, including, but not limited to, daily fines of $500 for continued violations, revocation of homeowner association membership privileges, legal action to place a lien on your property. Your compliance is expected. Sincerely, Karen Hathaway, Homeowner Association President." Carol's hands tightened around the paper. "A lien on our property? Are you kidding me?" Gary set his jaw, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "That's not happening." "What do we do?" Carol asked, her voice laced with frustration. "If we ignore them, what's stopping them from escalating?" Gary exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "We call a lawyer." They spent the rest of the day researching local homeowner association laws, calling attorney offices, and trying to get clarity on whether Karen had any actual legal standing to enforce these threats. Most responses were the same: the homeowner association could issue FES, but they couldn't legally force them to stop eating meat inside their own home. "So we're safe," Carol said, relieved. Gary wasn't so sure. "Legally, yeah, but legally and practically are two different things. If Karen thinks she's in charge, she's not just going to back down because we tell her she's wrong." Carol sighed, rubbing her temples. "So what's our next move?" Gary smirked, a hint of defiance flashing in his eyes. "We grill again." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gary set up their barbecue in the backyard. If Karen wanted to play dirty, so could they. He stacked charcoal into the grill, the satisfying crackle of the flames a small victory in itself. The smell of cooking steaks filled the air, thick and smoky, and sure enough, Karen appeared. She didn't storm into their yard or start yelling over the fence like last time. Instead, she stood perfectly still at the edge of the sidewalk, just past their property line. Dim glow of the street light cast eerie shadows across her face, her expression unreadable, Carol noticed. First, she nudged Gary and gestured toward the front yard. She's just standing there. Gary turned, expecting another round of self-righteous scolding, but Karen didn't move. She simply watched for several long seconds. No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of cycas and the occasional sizzle from the grill. Then Karen smiled, a slow, knowing, almost triumphant smile. Without a word, she pulled her phone from her pocket, tapped the screen, and turned away, disappearing down the sidewalk. Something about the way she left made Gary uneasy. She's up to something, Carol murmured. Gary nodded, his stomach twisting. I don't know what, but we're about to find out. At 3:42 a.m., the police arrived. The knock on the door was sharp and urgent, echoing through the house and jolting Gary awake. He stumbled out of bed, disoriented, and yanked the door open to find two uniformed officers standing on the porch. Their cruiser sat idling on the curb, red and blue lights flashing against the darkened houses. Mr. Green, one officer asked. Gary blinked the sleep from his eyes. Yeah. We received a report of a illegal animal process happening at this address, the officer said, glancing past Gary into the house. Your neighbor claims you've been engaging in unauthorized butchering and meat distribution. Gary stared at him. What? The officer shifted his weight. She provided evidence that you've been receiving shipments of raw meat and violating multiple health and safety codes. She also claims you've been selling animal products to other residents, which if true would be a zoning violation. Gary laughed out loud. You're telling me Karen called the cops because we had a barbecue? The second officer sighed, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, we're just here to follow up on the complaint. Do you mind if we take a look? Gary gritted his teeth. He wanted to slam the door in their faces, but he knew that wouldn't help fine. He muttered, stepping aside. The officers did a quick sweep of the kitchen and backyard, their flashlights flickering over the countertops and the now cold grill. Nothing illegal here. The first officer said, finally turning back to Gary. Look, I get it, these neighborhood disputes can get out of hand, but we have to respond when someone makes a report. Gary crossed his arms. And what happens when she does it again? The officer hesitated. If she keeps making false reports, she could face consequences for wasting police resources, but that's only if we can prove she's knowingly making fraudulent compel complaints. Gary clenched his fists. He knew exactly what Karen was doing, testing the waters, pushing the limits. And if she had the gall to call the police over a barbecue, what would she try next? As the officers left, Carol joined him at the door, wrapping her arms around herself. This is getting worse, she murmured. Gary exhaled, sharply, eyes locked on Karen's house across the street. Her curtains fluttered slightly, as if she'd been watching the whole thing. He didn't know what Karen's endgame was, but one thing was clear: she wasn't done, not even close, and neither was he. Gary spent the next few days waiting for the other shoe to drop. He knew Karen wasn't done. The woman was too obsessed, too self-righteous, to let something as trivial as legality get in her way, and he was right. It started with the neighbors. The morning after the police visit, Gary and Carol took their dog for a walk around the neighborhood. They quickly noticed something off. People were avoiding them. Mr. and Miss Patel, the friendly older couple who had welcomed them with a plate of homemade cookies on Movie Day, barely acknowledged them. The Johnson, who Gary had spoken to about possibly installing a basketball hoop in the cul-de-sac for the kids, crossed the street. When they saw him coming, Carol nudged Gary as they passed a group of neighbors standing at the entrance of the park. The conversation halted immediately, and the group stared at them, whispers trailing behind them as they walked away. She's poisoning them against us, Carol murmured under her breath. Gary tightened his grip on the leash. Yeah, but why? The answer came 2 hours later when Gary checked the neighborhood's private Facebook group. A post from Karen Hathaway, Homeowner Association president. As many of you know, we take great pride in our ethical, cruelty-free community. It has come to my attention that certain residents are attempting to disrupt the harmony we have worked so hard to build. It saddens me to report that these individuals have been knowingly violating our bylaws and engaging in dangerous, unsanitary behavior that puts our children and families at risk. I cannot legally name them here, but if you care about the health and safety of our neighborhood, please stay informed. Attend the next Homeowner Association meeting. We will be discussing a serious concern that affects us all. The post had hundreds of likes and dozens of comments. Who would do that? I knew something felt off about those new people. If they don't respect the rules, they shouldn't be here. Homeowner association should take action immediately. Gary clenched his jaw so hard his teeth hurt. She's trying to turn everyone against us before we even have a chance to defend ourselves. Carol sat down beside him on the couch, staring at the screen. We have to go to that meeting. Gary nodded. Oh, we're going. But we're not playing defense. We're fighting back. The homeowner association meeting was held in the community center, a bland beige building near the park. It was usually half empty, with only the most dedicated members showing up to discuss things like lawn height restrictions and fence colors. But tonight, the room was packed. Gary and Carol sat near the back, watching as Karen took center stage. She stood behind a podium, radiating authority, her clipboard resting beside her like a weapon. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice sweet but firm. We have several important topics to cover, but first, I'd like to address a serious violation that threatens the values we hold dear. Gary could feel the weight of dozens of eyes shifting in his direction. Karen continued. As you all know, we have worked tirelessly to ensure this community remains a safe, cruelty-free environment for our families. But unfortunately, some individuals have chosen to ignore these values. She paused for effect, allowing the room to soak in the drama. These individuals have not only refused to follow our bylaws, but have actively worked to undermine them. A murmur rippled through the crowd. They have brought animal carcasses into our neighborhood. They have hosted illegal gatherings where these carcasses were cooked and consumed in open defiance of our rules. Gary's fists clenched under the table. And just this week, Karen went on, her voice growing colder, these individuals have resorted to calling law enforcement against our community in a blatant attempt to intimidate us. Gary shot to his feet. That's a lie. The room went silent. Karen turned her head slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to speak. Mr. Green, she said, her tone perfectly controlled. Do you have something to say? Gary stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. You called the police on us. You accused us of running an illegal butchery out of our own home. You've harassed us, vandalized our property, and now you're spreading lies to turn the whole neighborhood against us. A few people shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Karen smiled. I'm simply enforcing the rules. The rules. Gary let out a harsh laugh. You mean the ones you made up? The ones that have no legal standing outside of your little fantasy world, where you get to control what people eat. Karen stiffened, but she recovered quickly. The community has spoken, Mr. Green. If you and your wife refuse to abide by our values, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you. Gary took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. That's not up to you. Karen's smile didn't waver, but something in her expression darkened. We'll see about that. That night, the final warning came. Gary and Carol were watching TV when a noise outside made them both sit up, a sharp, rhythmic tapping against the front door. Gary checked the peephole. No one there. He slowly opened the door. A single envelope lay on the welcome mat. No postage, no return address, just his name written in elegant cursive. Gary picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of Carol, taken from behind as she walked home from work the night before. No message, no threats, just the implication. Gary's blood ran cold. Carol, peering over his shoulder, gasped. Oh my God. Gary spun around, scanning the darkened street. No movement, no sign of who had delivered it. His hands trembled as he crumpled the photo into a fist. She's not just trying to find us anymore, he muttered. She's trying to scare us. Carol's voice shook. What do we do? Gary turned back toward the house, his mind already racing. We stopped playing defense. He looked down at the photograph, anger boiling over the fear. She wants a war. He let out a slow, steady breath. Then she's about to get one. Gary barely slept that night. His mind churned with anger, paranoia, and the unshakable realization that Karen was no longer just an overzealous homeowner association president. She was dangerous. The photograph of Carol had been a message, one that Gary couldn't ignore. Someone had followed her. Someone had stood in the darkness and taken that picture, knowing exactly what it would mean when he found it. He spent hours pacing the house, listening for any sound outside, but the street remained eerily silent. Carol had locked every door and window, but neither of them felt safe. By morning, Gary had made up his mind. "We have to hit back," he said over coffee, his voice tense. "Not just complain, not just ignore it. We need to take real action." Carol nodded, still shaken but resolute. "So what's the plan?" Gary clenched his jaw. "We document everything. The threats, the false police reports, the vandalism. And then we go to the authorities. Not just the police, but lawyers, the media, anyone who can put pressure on her." Carol exhaled, rubbing her temples. "You think they'll listen?" Gary gave her a hard look. "They will when we make them." That evening, as if on cue, Karen made her next move. It started with the power going out. The house was suddenly plunged into darkness just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Carol let out a startled gasp as the TV cut to black. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, and the quiet drone of the ceiling fan above them went dead. Gary immediately grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight. "Check outside," he said, already moving toward the back window. Carol hesitated. "You think it's her?" Gary didn't answer. He didn't need to. Peering through the blinds, he scanned the street. Their house was the only one in the dark. His stomach dropped. "She cut the power," he muttered. Carol's breath caught. "That's not just homeowner association harassment anymore. That's a crime." Gary had had enough. He stormed toward the door, shoving his feet into his shoes. "I'm confronting her." Carol grabbed his wrist. "Gary, wait." "No," he snapped. "She thinks she can do whatever she wants, that she owns this neighborhood. I'm ending this now." He yanked the door open and stepped outside. The air was heavy, humid, too quiet. The streetlights buzzed softly, casting long shadows. Gary stalked toward Karen's house, heart pounding, his fists clenched. Then movement. A dark shape darted across the yard, heading toward his house. Gary froze, eyes narrowing. Someone was there. Before he could react, a sharp bang shattered the silence. A gunshot. Gary barely had time to register what was happening before he heard Carol scream. Then another shot rang out. Gary spun, adrenaline surging through his veins. He raced back toward the house, his vision tunneling, his ears ringing. He reached the front porch just as Carol collapsed against the doorframe, clutching her side. Blood. So much blood. Gary caught her before she hit the ground, his hands already pressing against the wound. "Carol, oh God, stay with me." Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. Her fingers dug into his shirt, eyes wide with shock. Gary turned his head, scanning the darkness. Who the hell? Then he saw her. Karen. She stood at the edge of his yard, a revolver clutched in her hand, her chest rising and falling as if she had just run a marathon. Her eyes were wild, deranged, but her lips curled into a victorious smile. "I warned you," she whispered. Gary's blood boiled. He surged forward, but Karen took a step back, raising the gun again. "Stay where you are," she hissed. "I'll shoot again." Gary froze, every muscle in his body screaming to lunge at her. But Carol's ragged breath pulled him back. He couldn't leave her. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the police. Karen's head snapped toward the sound, her hand trembling on the gun. "You brought this on yourself," she spat. Then she turned and ran. Gary let out a shaky breath, ripping off his shirt to press against Carol's wound. "Hold on, baby. They're coming." Her fingers gripped his arm weakly. "Gary, listen. Don't talk," he whispered. "You're going to be okay." But the pool of blood beneath them was spreading fast, and Gary had never felt so helpless. The police arrived minutes later, sirens screaming as flashing red and blue lights painted the street in chaos. Karen was gone. The officers immediately rushed to Gary and Carol, one of them kneeling to assess the wound while another pulled Gary aside, bombarding him with questions. "Who shot her?" Gary's jaw tightened. "Karen Hathaway." The officer's eyes widened. "The homeowner association president?" "Yeah," Gary spat. "The lunatic has been harassing us for weeks. She cut our power, she called the cops on us, and now she just tried to murder my wife." The officer cursed under his breath, speaking into his radio. "Suspect is armed and on the run. Possible domestic terrorism case." Gary barely heard him. His eyes were locked on the ambulance pulling up, paramedics rushing toward. "Carol." They lifted her onto a stretcher, their hands quick and efficient, voices calm but urgent. One of them turned to Gary. "She's lost a lot of blood. We need to move fast." Gary followed them to the ambulance, his hands still stained red as the doors slammed shut. Gary made a silent vow. Karen thought she had won tonight, but she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. And when he found her, when he brought her down, there wouldn't be any second chances. Gary sat in the hospital waiting room, his hands still stained with Carol's blood. Tom had lost all meaning. The overhead lights flickered dimly, the antiseptic smell thick in the air. Every few minutes, his knee bounced restlessly, his mind replaying the last few hours in a loop of rage and fear. Karen had tried to kill his wife, and now she was out there somewhere in the dark, armed and unpredictable. A doctor finally emerged from the double doors. "Mr. Green," Gary leapt to his feet. "How is she?" "She lost a lot of blood," the doctor said, voice calm but firm. "The bullet tore through soft tissue but missed vital organs. She's stable now." "Lucky." Gary exhaled, his hands shaking from sheer relief. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded briefly. Gary followed him down the hall, heart pounding. When he stepped inside, Carol was pale but awake, an oxygen tube resting under her nose. Her eyes flickered open at the sound of his footsteps. "Hey," she whispered, her voice weak. Gary swallowed hard and forced a smile. "Hey, baby." He sat beside her, gently taking her hand. She squeezed it lightly. "Did they catch her?" His jaw tightened. "Not yet." A flicker of fear crossed her face. "She's still out there?" Gary forced himself to stay calm. Not for long. Outside the hospital, the police presence had doubled. Squad cars lined the parking lot, red and blue lights pulsing against the night sky. Officers were speaking in hushed tones, their radios buzzing with activity. Detective Kyle Harrison, a man with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who had seen too much, approached Gary with a clipboard. "Mr. Green," he said, extending a hand. "Detective Harrison, I need to ask you a few questions." Gary shook his hand, his grip tight. "You need to find her." Harrison nodded. "We're already on it. We've got every officer in the area looking for her. Roadblocks are up, airports and bus stations flagged. It's only a matter of time." Gary wasn't convinced. "She's smart. She planned this for weeks. You think she's just going to sit around and wait to be caught?" Harrison studied him for a moment. "No, but she's also desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." Gary wasn't interested in waiting for Karen to make a mistake. "I want to help," he said. Harrison sighed. "You've done enough for tonight. Go home. Get some rest." Gary scoffed. "You think I'm just going to sit on my ass while the woman who shot my wife is out there planning her next move?" The detective didn't argue. He simply exhaled, lowering his voice. "All right, here's what we know. She left her house before the police arrived. We found her car abandoned a few miles from here near a gas station. No sign of her on security cameras." Gary frowned. "Then she's still in the area." "That's what we think," Harrison said. "Admitted. But we need proof before we can move in." Gary had an idea. "What if I give her a reason to come out of hiding?" Harrison narrowed his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Gary's expression hardened. "I want to make her feel trapped, just like she did to us." The next morning, the plan went into motion. Gary made a public statement, something that would spread like wildfire through the neighborhood and beyond. He stood on the steps of the police station, cameras flashing as reporters shoved microphones in his face. "I want to make one thing clear," Gary said, his voice steady but cold. "Karen Hathaway is not a victim. She is a dangerous criminal. She shot my wife over a barbecue, and now she's hiding because she knows she's finished." The words were calculated, designed to draw her out. Karen was obsessed with control, and nothing would drive her mad faster than being powerless. "She thinks she can get away with this," Gary continued, locking eyes with the cameras. "But I promise you she won't. The entire country is watching now. She has nowhere to go." The statement aired everywhere that night. Gary's phone rang. Unknown number. His gut tightened. He answered. A familiar voice hissed through the speaker. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Gary's fingers curled into a fist. "You're done, Karen." She laughed, a manic, high-pitched sound. "You think I'm scared? You don't understand, Gary. I was saving this neighborhood. I was saving you." Gary took a slow breath. You shot my wife, Karen. Silence. Then, her voice dropped to a whisper. And I should have shot you too. The line went dead. Gary looked up at Detective Harrison, who had been listening in on the call through a wiretap. We got her, Harrison murmured. The phone pinged. They traced the location. Karen was still in the neighborhood. Within 10 minutes, SWAT teams moved in. The police surrounded an abandoned house on the outskirts of the community, one of the homes that had been foreclosed months ago. Gary stood at a distance, watching as officers with bulletproof vests and rifles stormed the property. For several long seconds, there was nothing. Then a gunshot. Gary's heart stopped. More shots followed, shouting, then silence. Minutes later, 2 officers emerged, dragging Karen in handcuffs. Her once pristine white blouse was stained with dirt and sweat, her hair wild, her expression a twisted mix of rage and fear. She fought against the officers, screaming, her voice raw and broken. They're ruining this neighborhood. You don't understand. I was right. Gary stepped forward, standing just a few feet from her. Karen's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, there was no power left in them. Just defeat. You lost, Gary said simply. She lunged toward him, but the officers yanked her back. Gary watched as they shoved her into the squad car, the doors slamming shut behind her. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. 2 weeks later, Gary sat beside Carol's hospital bed, her fingers laced through his. Is it over? She asked softly. Gary exhaled. Yeah, it's over. Karen was facing multiple felony charges: attempted murder, illegal firearm possession, stalking, harassment. Her lawyer had already started talking about an insanity plea, but it wouldn't matter. She wasn't getting out. Gary squeezed Carol's hand. Let's go home. Carol smiled faintly. And then what? Gary leaned closer, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Then, he murmured, we have a barbecue.